just like their stats, accomplishments, and the teams they chose to play for. Contracts for players are ever-changing. Total salaries, cap hits, clauses added, etc, etc. What began as just getting paid to start quickly became much more complex with time. Therefore, as we do often here, we're going to take a look at this upcoming season's worst contracts league-wide. Keep in mind, we're really focusing more on term and total salary in this video than anything. And with that, here are the top 7 worst contracts that the upcoming season has to offer. Ever since former GM Del Talon signed Sergei Bobrovsky to a massive $70 million contract, it's never proceeded to be anything but an overpayment. Since he did capture 2 Vezinas during his time with Columbus, the assumption was that Bob would remain as one of the top netminders league-wide. And throughout his first 2 seasons as a Panther, Bobrovsky's contract was continuously competing for first place when it came to the worst deal in the NHL. Goaltender gets paid 7 figures and just barely scrapes by and avoids that less than .900 save percentage, like he literally recorded a .900 in his debut season as a Panther. So it was extremely close. However, last campaign, as the team had more success, so did the main man between the pipes, as Bob did manage to notch a .913 save percentage and a much improved goals against average with a 2.67. Even still, if we're considering things like contract amount, term, and the no move clause that remains until 2024, then there's plenty of reasons as to why it should still be here. If we're looking at the big picture though, since his signing bonus will decrease over time, his total salary will be half of what it is today in the final season. Even still, if we're going by total salary alone, the goaltender will be the 4th highest paid player to start the season. And considering that he hasn't been among the best in the league and net for quite some time, makes his contract still an albatross of a deal in the end. Unlike what we see today, where players are given massive contracts right out of their ELCs, for Drew Doughty, it was almost the opposite, meaning that for the longest time, and for the majority of his career rather, the defenseman was making $7 million or less a season, even after he was one of the biggest reasons as to why the LA Kings won 2 Stanley Cups. Doughty wasn't given a true payout until much later. In 2019, just shy of his 30th birthday, Doughty was signed to a lucrative 8-year, $88 million contract that sports an AAV of $11 million. Up until that point, as I alluded to, Doughty was a stable force from the back end that had 3 50-point seasons and a Norris to his name. Therefore, it only made sense that he would be rewarded eventually, but since GM at the time, Rob Blake, decided to reward him in the latter stages of his career, it wasn't viewed as the most valuable investment. What really makes this deal a tough one to endorse is the fact that it's not front-loaded at all, but rather the value from year to year remains the same, $11 million a season. Meaning that Doughty is going to be making $11 million well into his late 30s until the deal expires in 2027. There is a little bit of an upside, however, in that his full no move clause will switch to a modified no trade clause in 2023, but will exclude all but 7 teams Doughty could be traded to. Despite this though, theoretically, unless his career is cut short, the contract would be nearly impossible to move without salary retention realistically. This isn't to say that the defenseman can still contribute, as he recorded 31 points in 39 games played last campaign. Well, it was either Erik Karlsson or Marc-Edouard Vlasic, and considering we've talked about Karlsson ad nauseum over the years on this subject, and Vlasic is also older, I decided I'd go a different route this time. I'd say, similarly to Doughty, Vlasic has become a victim of bad timing, as for the longest time, the defenseman was considered one of the most underrated players in the league. And in 2018, GM Doug Wilson decided to change that by giving Vlasic an 8-year extension. What makes this so tragic for the Sharks is the fact that throughout the past few seasons, his productivity and value have both plummeted. According to an article from The Athletic, which I'll link below, his current market value is currently around $700,000 a season, but yet he's making $7 million. Last season, Vlasic, following 75 games played, was only able to muster up 14 points and recorded the least amount of ice time yet in his career, with around 15 minutes. With 4 more years remaining on his contract, Vlasic does have a modified no-trade clause kicking in on next season, which will override his no-move clause. However, even if San Jose can somehow entice a suitor, the clause only allows for 3 potential teams that he could be traded to. Out of everyone in this list, Jeff Skinner has had the most difficult of scenarios to deal with over the years. After he had a sensational debut season as a Sabre, Jason Botterill decided to reward him with an 8-year, $72 million contract. For the most part, Skinner hasn't been able to earn the full $10 million in salary that he's been paid yearly. But in reality, his struggles to remain consistent aren't completely his fault. First, there was former head coach Ralph Krueger, who decided to bury Skinner in the bottom 6 and restrict his playing time during his tenure with the team. Secondly, for a while, there was the so-called Buffalo effect that many players spoke of feeling, especially towards the end of the Jack Eichel era. Therefore, while taking all these factors into consideration, Skinner isn't fully to blame. Last season, however, could be considered an outlier, meaning that Skinner was able to bounce back and recorded 63 points in 80 games played while playing top-line minutes. Even though this was a turnaround, the offensive output was far from matching his $10 million price tag. Referring back to The Athletic, Skinner's market value last season was even less than half of what he was being paid at $4.8 million. Comparatively, Skinner ranked 73rd in total points league-wide and will have a full no-move clause on his deal until it expires in 2027. Even though it's a new contract, I have the feeling that this one is going to become the old reliable per se for years to come when making these types of lists. When Seth Jones was traded to Chicago, it was the summer for defensemen to get paid. Cale Makar, Dougie Hamilton, and Miro Heiskanen, just to name a few, were given fresh contracts, while some took effect to start the 2021-2022 campaign. Others had a later start date. And for Jones, as he signed his 8-year, $72 million contract, this was a signal, at least at the time, that Chicago was serious about trying to remain competitive. Well, as most of us know, the closer the defenseman's contract came to expiring, the worse things began to appear in Chi-Town. Currently, at 27 years of age, Jones is going to be receiving a 7-figure salary for the first 4 years due to the contract being front-loaded. Despite the fact, though, that his income will dwindle theoretically along with his production, the fact that there's a full no-move clause in effect until the deal's expiration is yet another reason as to why, for me, it's one of the worst. After a slower start to the season, though, Jones was able to record 51 points on a struggling team after 78 games played. Therefore, the worst part about it isn't how Jones is performing now, but rather the length and term, as he'll be 35 years old when the deal expires. Also, knowing where Chicago is now, considering their obvious objective to rebuild, it's looking like Jones isn't going to exactly be a match for Chicago, say in 5 or 6 years down the road. Speaking of D-men who got paid last summer, Darnell Nurse was yet another player in that category. And really, when looking at Nurse's situation in comparison to Jones's, it's quite similar. Both are 27 and received likely the biggest payouts of their lives with 8-year contracts. For Nurse, his deal is quite similar, but slightly more at $74 million versus $72. The main question with Nurse, however, is, and has been, is he truly worthy of being paid like a #1 defenseman? While there's no doubt that he can effectively eat minutes and contribute on the score sheet, his defensive game has been more of a concern. Even though he did seem to improve last season, it's hard to tell if he'll remain consistent throughout the entirety of the contract. Similarly to the Jones deal, this one is also front-loaded, but in contrast, has a modified no-trade clause for the last 3 years. Nurse, who tallied 35 points and 71 games played last campaign, is going to be making $12 million in total salary this upcoming season. Therefore, in comparison, it then becomes more understandable as to why, in my opinion, this is a severe overpayment. As you can see, by salary alone, Nurse is set to make as much as his captain Connor McDavid, down to the very penny. Surprisingly, this time around, the worst contract on this list doesn't belong to a defenseman, but but rather a forward. Yes, in case you didn't catch the video I released last month, we questioned the validity of Tyler Seguin being a star player today. And obviously, this is going to be a similar take, but we'll be relying instead on the more financial side of things. For Seguin, he hasn't come close for the past 2 seasons to resembling the same player that notched 80 points in a full season's play. However, the reason behind the sudden mediocrity could be related to the fact that according to Seguin, he hasn't been the same since undergoing surgeries on his knee and hip. Even though he returned after receiving surgery to play last season, he was far from himself and fell just shy of scoring 50 points after 81 games played with 49. But even though we know why Seguin has fallen short, it still doesn't change the fact that his total salary for next season is going to be an outrageous overpayment. Based on the salary, Seguin will be the highest paid player league-wide and will receive $13 million. And to make matters worse, there's a full no move clause as well on the deal until it expires in 2027. By then, Seguin will be in his mid-30s.